Chapter 4. Markets in Action. Chapter Objectives. 1. Explain why the competitive market is efficient. 2. Describe sources of market failure. 3. Analyze the impact of price controls on market efficiency. 4. Describe how policies can be used to correct the impacts of externalities on the market efficiency. In Chapter 3, we saw how markets achieve equilibrium. We begin Chapter 4 by showing that in a competitive market, this equilibrium is an efficient use of their resources. We go on to explore situations where the market fails to achieve this outcome, as well as the consequences of government policies aimed at controlling markets. 4-1. Market efficiency. In Chapter 2, we learned how the economists use the term efficiency to describe a situation where society is doing the best it can with its existing resources and technology. A rational decision maker decides on an option only if the marginal benefit, which is determined by consumer preferences, exceeds the marginal cost, opportunity cost. This means that society should continue to allocate resources to the reduction of a good as long as the marginal benefit of doing so is greater than the marginal cost, and society should stop allocating more resources to a reduction of that good when the marginal benefit of doing so is equal to the marginal cost. Moreover, if the marginal benefit from a good is less than the marginal cost of its production, then the less of the good should be produced and the fewer resources devoted to its production. We will now show that efficiency is achieved from competitive market equilibrium. Exhibit 1 illustrates how a demand curve represents a consumer's marginal benefit. A demand curve shows different qualities of product consumers are willing to purchase at various prices. In Part A, we produce Fred's demand curve for t-shirts from Chapter 3. Point A shows, for example, that at a price of $25, Fred wouldn't purchase one t-shirt. This means that Fred is willing to pay $25 for the first t-shirt. Willingness to pay represents the value or benefit Fred receives from the t-shirt. Fred will be willing to pay $20 for the second t-shirt, point B. So the marginal or incremental benefit of the second t-shirt is $20. The demand curve then represents Fred's marginal benefit for t-shirts. Recall that the market demand is a horizontal sum of the quantities demanded by all consumers in the market at various prices, and as such represents the overall marginal benefit, MB, to society's t-shirts, sometimes referred as the marginal social benefit. Exhibit 1. Demand is marginal benefit. Supply is marginal cost. Fred's demand for t-shirt curve shows Fred's willingness to purchase t-shirts at various prices. For example, point A and point A shows that at the price of $20, Fred would purchase one t-shirt. In other words, Fred is willing to pay $25 for the first t-shirt. Willingness to pay reflects the value or benefit Fred receives from that t-shirt. Fred will be willing to pay $20 for the second t-shirt. Because the demand represents Fred's willingness to pay, it also measures the marginal benefit. Part B shows the supply curve of Shirley shirts, one from the t-shirt industry. Sellers are only willing to offer a product for sale if they cover the opportunity cost of doing so. At $5, point C, Shirley is willing to reduce 5,000 t-shirts. To reduce 10,000 t-shirts, she would require $10 per shirt, point D, to cover the increasing opportunity cost or marginal cost of increased production. The supply curve then represents the marginal cost of production. A supply curve shows the different quantities of products sellers are willing to produce and offer for sale at various prices. Sellers are only willing to offer a product for sale if they can cover the marginal cost MC of doing so. In Part B, we produce the supply curve for Shirley shirts. At $5, point C, Shirley is willing to produce 5,000 t-shirts. Shirley would only be willing to produce 10,000 t-shirts at point D if she could cover the marginal cost of doing so at $10 per t-shirt. The supply curve then represents Shirley's marginal cost of production. The market supply is the horizontal sum of all the quantities supplied by producers at various prices and represents the overall marginal cost of production, sometimes referred as the marginal social cost. Take note, the demand curve that shows consumers' willingness to pay for a product is the marginal benefit curve. The supply curve, which shows the maximum price necessary for producers to cover the opportunity cost of production and be willing to offer a product for sale, is the marginal cost curve. Exhibit 2 shows a market for t-shirts with an equilibrium price of $15 and a quantity of 300,000, point B. Since the demand shows the marginal benefit and supply shows the marginal cost, this equilibrium is efficient. If less than 300,000 t-shirts were produced, say 200,000, then the marginal benefit, $25 at point A, would exceed the marginal cost, $10 at point B. From society's perspectives, an underproduction of t-shirts has occurred. And efficiency will require that more resources be devoted to the production of t-shirts. Conversely, if more than 300,000 t-shirts were reduced, say 400,000 t-shirts, then the marginal benefit, $5 at point F, would be less than the marginal cost, $20 at point G, and an overproduction will occur. Efficiency will require that fewer resources be devoted to the production of t-shirts. Take note, the competitive market equilibrium is efficient because at that level of production, the marginal benefit of consumption is just equal to the marginal cost of reduction. Am I on track? 1. In the market for tricycles, the marginal benefit of the last tricycle sold was greater than the marginal cost of reducing that tricycle. In this situation, A. There's an underproduction of tricycles and the market is inefficient. B. There's an overproduction of tricycles and the market is inefficient. C. The current production level is efficient. Or D. There's an underproduction of tricycles and the market is efficient. Exhibit 2. The competitive market is efficient. The market equilibrium, point E, results in a situation where the marginal benefit, MB, equals the marginal cost, so is efficient. At 200,000 t-shirts, an inefficient underproduction occurs because the MB of $25, point A, exceeds the MC of $10, point B, and the efficiency would require that more resources be devoted to the production of t-shirts. At 400,000 t-shirts, an inefficient overproduction occurs because the marginal cost of $20, point G, exceeds the marginal benefit of $5, point F, and the efficiency would require that fewer resources be devoted to the production of t-shirts. 4-2. Sources of market failure. In the previous chapter, you've gained an understanding of how markets operate. Through the price system, society coordinates economic activity, and in a well-functioning competitive market, resources are allocated efficiently through the system. But markets do not always achieve market efficiency. Sometimes markets result in a misallocation of resources. Market failure occurs when market equilibrium results in too few or too many resources being used in the production of a good or service. In this section, you'll study 3 important cases of market failure: lack of competition, externalities, and public goods. 4-2A. Lack of competition. There must be a competition among both producers and consumers. Exhibit 3. Rigging the PC market. When sellers compete, equilibrium occurs at point E1. The price charged per PC is $1,500, and the quantity of PCs exchanged is 200,000. This is efficient level of production because MB equals MC. Suppose, however, suppliers are using collusion or other means to restrict the supply of this product. The decrease in supply from S1 to S2 establishes an insignificant market equilibrium at E2. At E2, firms charge higher price of $2,500, and the equilibrium quantity of PCs falls to 150,000. Marginal benefit, point E2, exceeds the marginal cost, point A, and the market fails because firms use few resources to produce fewer than the optimal number of PCs while charging a higher, artificially high price. 4-2A. Lack of competition. There must be competition among both producers and consumers for markets to function properly. But what happens if producers fail to compete? In The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith stated, people have the same traits seldom meet together, even for merit and division, and the conversation ends with a conspiracy against the public, or some diversion to raise prices. This famous quote underscores the fact that in the real world, businesses seek ways to replace consumer sovereignty with big business sovereignty. What happens when a few firms rig the market and become the market's boss? By restricting supply through artificial limits on the output of a good, firms can enjoy higher prices and profits. As a result, firms may waste resources and slow technology and innovation. Exhibit 3 illustrates how IMB, Apple, Gateway, Dell, and other suppliers of personal computers could benefit from breaking the market. S1 shows the supply curve when sellers compete, and shown as in the previous section, reflects the marginal cost of production. At point E1, the competitive price for PCs is $1,500. The quantity of 200,000 per month is sold, and the market efficiency prevails. Sellers, however, can increase profits by taking steps that would make PCs artificially scarce and raise the price. Graphically, the sellers wish to shift the competitive supply curve S1 leftward to the restricted supply curve S2. This could happen for a number of reasons, including an agreement among sellers to restrict supply. Although producers benefit by artificially restricting supply and raising the price, point E2, the lack of competition means economy losses. When only 150,000 PCs are sold, the marginal benefit of the last unit sold at 2,500 at point E2 exceeds the marginal cost of 1,000 at point A, and too few resources are devoted to reducing PCs. Note that under U.S. antitrust laws, the Department of Justice is responsible for prosecuting firms that collide to restrict supply to force higher prices. Take note, if firms are able to reduce competition by colliding to restrict supply, then will result in an inefficient equilibrium with an artificially high price and too few resources devoted to the production of a good. 4-2b, externalities. Even when the markets are competitive, some markets may still fail because they suffer from the presence of side effects economists call externalities. An externality is a cost or benefit imposed on people other than the consumers and producers of a good or service. Externalities are also called spillovers, spillover effects, or neighborhood effects. People other than the consumer and producers who are affected by the side effects of market exchange are called third parties. Externalities may be negative or positive. That is, they may be detrimental or beneficial. Suppose you are trying to study, and your roommate is listening to the steel porcupines at full blast. The action of your roommate is imposing an unwanted external cost or negative externality on you and other third parties who are trying to study or sleep. Externalities can also result in an external benefit or positive externality to non-participating parties. When a community proudly displays its neat lawns, gorgeous flowers, and freshly painted homes, visitors are third parties who did none of the work but enjoy the benefit of the pleasant scenery. A graphical analysis of pollution. Exhibit 4 provides a graphical analysis of two markets that fail to include externalities in their market prices, unless the government takes corrective action. Exhibit 4a shows a market for steel, in which steel frames burn high sulfur fuel and pollute the environment. Demand curve D and supply curve S1 establish the inefficient equilibrium E1 in the steel market. Not included in S1 are the external costs to the public, because the steel firms are not paying for the damage from the smoke emissions. If steel frames discharge smoke and ash into the environment, foul air reduces property values, raises healthcare costs, and generally erodes the quality of life. Because supply curve S1 does not include the external costs, they also not include the price of steel, Q1. At Q1 units of production, there's an over-allocation of resources to this market, as the four marginal cost of production, point A, exceeds the marginal benefit, E1. In short, the absence of the cost of pollution and the price of steel means that firms produce more steel and pollution than socially desirable. Exhibit 4. Externalities in steel and COVID vaccine markets. In Part A, S1 represents the situation where steel markets do not include the cost per ton of pollution and the cost of per ton. Supply curve S2 includes the external cost of pollution, so E2 reflects the efficient quantity of production that would occur if all costs were included. Resources, however, are over-calculated at inefficient market equilibrium 1, E1. MC at point A is greater than MV at point E1 because firms do not consider the cost of pollution. Part B demonstrates the external benefits that cause an underallocation of resources and inefficient output at market equilibrium point E1 results when the external benefits of vaccinations are now considered as the full marginal benefit, point B, exceeds the marginal cost, point E1, at a quantity of Q1. S2 is the supply curve that would exist if the external cost of respiratory illnesses, dirty homes, and other undesirable side effects were included. This supply curve represents the full marginal cost of production to society. At equilibrium point E2, the steel market would achieve allocative efficiency. Because S2 includes the cost of environmental damage, the efficient equilibrium price would be at P2, and the quantity would be at Q2. At E2, the marginal benefit is equal to the full marginal cost of production. Take note, when a supply curve fails to include external costs, the equilibrium price is artificially low, and the equilibrium quantity is artificially high. External costs cause the market to over-allocate resources. A graphical analysis of COVID-19 vaccinations. In our previous example, the supply curve did not include the external costs of a product. Now you'll see the demand curve may not include the external benefits of a product. Consider the vaccines created to protect against COVID-19. Exhibit 4b illustrates this market. Demand curve D1 reflects the price consumers would pay for shots to receive the benefit of the reduced probability of infection. Supply curve S shows the quantities of shots supplied offered for sale at different prices. At equilibrium point E1, the market fails to achieve an efficient allocation of resources. The reason is that when buyers are vaccinated, other people who do not purchase them shots, called free riders, also benefit because the disease is less likely to spread to them. Demand curve D2 includes external benefits to non-consumers of vaccinations, and therefore represents a full marginal benefit to society. At Q1, the marginal benefit point B exceeds the marginal cost, resulting in under-allocation of resources. At E2, the efficient equilibrium sellers devote greater resources to vaccinations, and the under-calculation of resources would be eliminated. Later in this chapter, we discuss the impact of government intervention in market for vaccinations. When the demand curve fails to include the external benefits, the equilibrium price is artificially low, and the equilibrium quantity is artificially low. External benefits cause the market to under-allocate resources. Am I on track? 2. When there are external costs associated with the production of a good, the market equilibrium price will be artificially blank, and the market equilibrium will be artificially blank. A, high high, B, high low, C, low high, or D, low low. 4-2C. Public goods. Private goods are produced through the price system. In contrast, natural events is an example of a public good provided by the government because of its special characteristics. A public good is a good or service that, once produced, has two properties. 1. Users collectively consume the benefits, and 2. There's no way to bear anyone who doesn't pay free riders from consuming the good or service. To see why the market fails to reduce the optimal amount of public goods or service, imagine the Parrot Missiles Inc. offers to sell missile defense systems to people who want private protection from attacks by incoming missiles. First, once the system is operational, everyone in the defended area benefits from the increased safety. Second, the non-inclusive nature of the public good means it is impossible or very costly for any owner of a Parrot missile defense system to prevent non-owners, free riders, from reaping the benefits of its protection. Given the two properties of a public good, why would any private individual purchase a Parrot missile defense system? Why not wait until someone else buys a missile system and take the free ride? Every person wants a Parrot missile system but doesn't want to bear the cost of the system when everyone else shares the benefits. As a result, the market fails to provide Parrot missile defense systems, and everyone hopes no missile attacks occur before someone finally decides to purchase one. Government can solve this problem by reducing Parrot missiles and taxing the public to pay for them. Unlike a private citizen, government can use force to collect payments and prevent the free rider problem. Other examples of public goods include global agreements to reduce emissions, the judicial system, the National Emergency Warning System, air traffic control, prisons, dams, city roads, police and fire protection, and traffic lights. Take note, if public goods are available only in the marketplace, people wait for someone else to pay, and the result is the underproduction or zero production of public goods. 4-3. Policies to correct market failure. The government intervenes in some markets to correct the market failures just described. Here, we discussed 3 potential tools it can use to influence the market. 1. Regulation. 2. Price controls. And 3. Taxes and subsidies. 4-3A. Regulation. The government can enact legislation to create rules or set standards that firms and households must follow. For example, laws existing regarding workplace safety, protecting the government, environment, banking, and many other things. Often regulation is used to override market inefficiencies. Consider the market for steel in Exhibit 4, Part A. When the market over-allocating resources to the production of steel but not including the external cost of pollution, the government could enact legislation that could force firms to reduce their emissions as a condition of remaining in business. When the extra cost of anti-pollution equipment is added to the production cost per ton of steel, the initial supply curve S1 in Exhibit 4A shifts leftward to the supply curve at S2, shifting the equilibrium to E2, and resulting in firms reducing the efficient or socially optimal amount. Now consider the unallocation of resources shown in the market for COVID-19 vaccinations in Part B of Exhibit 4. The government could boost consumption and shift the demand curve rightward by acquiring all citizens to obtain shots. This approach is capturing external benefits in market demand explains why all school-aged children must have polio and other shots before attending school. The government, of course, must factor in not just economic considerations, but also social and political considerations when making policy decisions. 4-3b. Price controls. The government intervenes in some markets with the objective of preventing prices from rising to the market equilibrium level. In other markets, the government's goal is to intervene and maintain a price higher than the market's equilibrium price. We now consider what happens when government sets prices. There are two types of price controls: price ceilings and price floors. Price ceilings. What happens if the government prevents the price system from setting a market price too high by mandating a price ceiling? A price ceiling is a legally established maximum price a seller can charge. Rent controls are an example of an imposition of a price ceiling in the market for rental units. New York City, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, San Francisco, and other commutes in the United States have some form of rent control. Since World War I, rent controls have been widely used in Europe. The rationale for rent controls is to prevent an essential service that would otherwise be unaffordable by many people at the equilibrium rental price. Let's see why rent controls can be counterproductive. Exhibit 5 shows the quantity of retail units demanded and supplied per month in a hypothetical city. We begin the analysis by assuming no rent controls exist, and the equilibrium is at point E, with a monthly rent of $1,200 per month, and 6 million units occupied. Notice that E, MB equals MC, and the market is efficient. Next, assume the city council imposes a rent control, ceiling price, that by law prevents any landlord from renting a unit more than $800 per month. What does market supply and demand theory predict will happen? At the low ceiling of $800, the quantity demanded of rental units will be 8 million, but the quantity supplied will only be 4 million. The price ceiling creates a persistent market shortage of 4 million rental units because suppliers cannot raise the rental price without being subject to legal penalties. At 4 million rental units sold, the marginal benefit, point C, exceeds the marginal cost, point B, and the rent control has created an inefficiency in the market, an under-allocation of resources devoted to rental housing. Noted that the rent ceiling is at or above $1,200 per month could have no effect. If the ceiling is at the set of the equilibrium rent of $1,200, the quantity of rental units demanded and the quantity of rental units supplied are equal, regardless of rent control. If the rent ceiling is set above the equilibrium rent, the quantity of rental units supplied exceeds the quantity of rental units demand, and this surplus will cause the market to adjust to the equilibrium rent of $1,200. What is the impact of rent controls on consumers? First, as a substitute for paying higher rent prices, consumers may spend more time waiting on waiting lists and searching for housing. This means that consumers incur an opportunity cost added to the $800 rent set by the government. Second, an illegal market or black market can arise because of the excess of quantity demanded. Because price of rent units are artificially low, the profit motive encourages tenants to risk breaking the law by subsetting their unit to the highest bidder over $800 per month. From a seller's perspective, rent control encourages two undesirable effects. One, faced with mandated low rent, landlords may cut maintenance expenses, and housing deterioration will reduce the stock of rental units in the long run. Second, landlords may use discriminatory practices to replace the price system. Once owners realize there's excess quantity demanded for rentals at the controlled price, they may resort to preferences based on pet ownership or family size to determine how to allocate scarce rental resources. Exhibit 5. Rent controls results in a shortage of rental units. If no rent controls exist, rent for a hypothetical apartment is $1,200 per month at the efficient equilibrium point E. However, if the government imposes a rent ceiling of $800 per month, quantity demanded, point A, will exceed the quantity supplied, point B, and a persistent shortage of 4 million rental units occurs. The market inefficiency is created by a marginal benefit, point C, exceeds the marginal cost, point B, because rent cannot rise by law. One outcome is that consumers must search for available units instead of paying a higher rent. Other outcomes include a black market, bribes, discrimination, and other illegal methods of dealing with the storage of 4 million rental units per month. Take note, a price ceiling such as rent control establishes the maximum price a seller can charge and results in shortage in the market. Price floors. The other side of the price control coin is the price floor set by government because fears that the price ceiling might establish a market viewed as being too low. A price floor is a legally established minimum price a seller can be paid. The minimum wage is an example of a price floor. Exhibit 6 shows the result of a minimum wage on the unskilled labor market. The demand for unskilled labor is a downward sloping curve. The wage rate on the vertical axis is the price of unskilled labor, and the amount an unskilled labor employees are willing to hire varies inversely with the wage rate. At a higher wage rate, businesses will hire fewer workers. At the lower wage rate, they will employ a larger quantity of workers. Exhibit 6. A minimum wage results in a surplus of labor. When the federal or state government sets a wage rate floor above the equilibrium wage, a surplus of unskilled labor develops. The supply curve is the number of workers offering their labor services per year at possible wage rates. The demand curve is the number of workers employers are willing and able to hire at various wage rates. Equilibrium wage, WE, the result of the price system is allowed to operate without government intervention. At the minimum wage of WM, there is a surplus of unemployed workers, QS minus QD. On the supply side, the wage rate determines the number of unskilled workers willing to and able to work per year. At higher wages, workers will give up leisure or schooling to work, and at lower wages, fewer workers will be available for hire. The upward sloping curve in Exhibit 6 is the supply of labor. Assuming the freedom to bargain, the price system will establish an equilibrium wage rate, WE, and an equilibrium quantity of labor employed, QE. But suppose the government enacts a minimum wage, WM, which is a price floor above the equilibrium wage, WE. The intent for legislation is to make a lower-paid workers better off with a higher wage rate, but consider the consequences. One result of artificially high minimum wage is that the number of workers willing to offer their labor increases upward along the supply curve QS, but there are fewer jobs because the number of workers firms are willing to hire decreases to QD on the demand curve. The predicted outcome of labor surplus of unskilled workers, QS minus QD, who are unemployed. Moreover, employers are encouraged to substitute machines and skilled labor for the unskilled labor previously employed at the equilibrium wage, WE. Ironically, when the minimum wage was enacted, employers laid off some of the lowest skilled workers, exactly the type of workers minimum wage legislation intends to help. When some employment is drawn back the minimum wage, those workers who are still employed, QD, are better off. Moreover, when their additional income is spent, it generates more sales, more production, and some job creation that could be offset at least some additional unemployment over a period of time. Even though the minimum wage causes a reduction in employment, at least in the short run, some economists argue that a more equal and fair income distribution is worth the loss of some jobs. Moreover, the shape of labor demanding curve may be much more vertical than shown in Exhibit 6. If this is the case, the unemployment effect of a rise in the minimum wage would be small. In addition, it is impossible the minimum wage may overpower unskilled workers, who often lack bargaining power with employers, and obtaining higher wages. Finally, a minimum wage set below the equilibrium wage rate is ineffective. If the minimum wage is set at the equilibrium rate, WE, the quantity of labor demanded and the quantity of labor supplied are equal regardless of the minimum wage. If the minimum wage is set below the equilibrium wage, The forces of supply and demand for labor establish the equilibrium wage, regardless of the minimum wage rate. Take note. A price floor establishes a minimum price a seller can charge and results in a surplus in the market. A minimum wage is an example of a price floor in the labor market and the surplus that results in unemployment. Am I on track? 3. Unemployment results when government imposes A. A price ceiling above the equilibrium wage in the labor market. B. A price ceiling below the equilibrium wage in the labor market. C. A price floor above the equilibrium wage in the labor market. Or D. A price floor below the equilibrium wage in the labor market. A closer look. Applicable concept. Public good versus private goods. Can vouchers fix our schools? In their book Free to Choose, published in 1980, economist Milton Friedman and his wife Rose Friedman proposed a voucher plan for school. The objective of their proposal was retain government financing but give parents greater freedom to choose the schools their children attend. The Friedmans point out that under the current system, parents face a strong incentive to not remove their children from public schools. The reason is because if parents decide to withdraw their children from a public school and send them to a private school, they must pay private tuition in addition to the taxes that finance children enrolled in public schools. To remove the financial penalty that limits the freedom of parents to choose schools, the government could give parents a voucher, which is a piece of paper redeemable for a sum of money payable to a approvable school. For example, if a government spends $8,000 per year to educate a student, then the voucher could be this amount. The voucher plan embodies the same principle as the GI Bill that provides educational benefits to military veterans. The veteran receives a voucher good only for educational expenses and is free to choose the school where it is used, provided the school satisfies certain standards. The Friedmans argued that parents could and should be permitted to use the vouchers not only at private schools, but also at other public schools, and not only at schools in their own district, city, or state, but any school that is willing to accept their child. That option would give every parent a greater opportunity to choose. At the same time, it would require public schools to charge tuition. The tuition would be competitive because public schools must compete for students both with other public schools and private schools. It is important to note that this plan relieves no one from the burden of taxation to pay for schooling. It simply gives parents a wider choice as to which community schools their children can attend, given the amount of funding per student that the community has obligated itself to provide. The plan does not affect the present standards imposed on private schools to ensure that students attending them satisfy the customary attendance laws. In 1990, Milwaukee began an experiment with school vouchers. The program gave selected students from low-income families taxpayer-funded vouchers and allowed them to attend private schools. There was a continuing heated debate among parents, politicians, and educators over the result. In 1998, Wisconsin's highest court ruled in a 4-2 decision that Milwaukee can use public money for vouchers for students who attend religious schools without violating the Constitution's separation of church and state. The 2002 article of U.S. Today reported, opponents of vouchers have reportedly argued that they wouldn't damage the public schools, draining them of resources and better students. A recent study from Milwaukee Voucher Program by Caroline Hawksby, a Harvard economist, suggests just the opposite. She wrote that schools that face the most potential competition from vouchers have the most productive response. No doubt, the nation's experience with vouchers is limited, but the evidence in recent Brookings Institution report shows that they do seem to have benefit African American youngsters. Excuse me. The controversy continues. For example, in a 2002 landmark case, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that government vouchers for private or American schools are constitutional. In 2003, however, a Denver judge struck down Colorado's new school voucher law, ruling that it violated the state's constitution by stripping local school boards of their control over education. In 2006, the Florida Supreme Court ruled that Florida's voucher program for students is the lowest rated public schools that was unconstitutional. Then in 2010, Florida legislated a tax credit voucher plan for low-income students. In 2013, The Indiana Supreme Court upheld the state's vouchers program, which is the nation's broadcast school voucher program. And in 2014-2015 school year, North Carolina awarded vouchers to students whose family meets certain income requirements. In 2015, a renewed debate was sparked by President Trump's appointment of Best Buy's DeVitos, a longtime supporter of school vouchers, as the Secretary of Education. 4-3C. Taxes and subsidies. Another approach for government to take control or correct for market failures is to use taxes and subsidies to alter the cost and benefits in a market. Exhibit 7 shows the effects of each. In Part A, the government taxes producers for each unit sold, which adds to the cost reduction and shifts the supply curve leftward to S1 to S2. The equilibrium moves from E1 to E2, which raises the prices and reduces the quantity in the market. In Part B, the government subsidies pays consumers for each unit purchased, which increases the benefits from consumption and shifts the demand curve rightward from D1 to D2. The equilibrium moves from E1 to E2, which raises the prices and increases the quantity in the market. How can the use of taxes and subsidies counteract the market failures? Consider the market for steel once again in Exhibit 4, Part A. Recall that when producers do not consider the external cost of pollution, equilibrium 1 results and they produce more output, Q1, than the efficient level of output, Q2, where the marginal benefit equals the full marginal social cost of production, Point E2. Considering what happens if the government levied a tax per ton of steel equal to the external cost imposed on society when the firm emits pollution into the air. The additional production cost per ton of steel from the pollution tax shifts the supply curve leftward from S1 to S2. As shown, the production and the pollution is reduced. Again, the objective is to change the equilibrium from E1 to E2 and eliminate the overallocation of resources devoted to steel production. The tax revenue would be used to compensate these damaged by pollution. What about market failure that resulted in underproduction of COVID-19 vaccinations in Exhibit 4B? The government could shift the demand curve rightward by reducing a supply to consumers by paying each citizen a dollar amount equal to the amount of external benefits per shot received. The rightward shift of the demand curve increases the price and quantity until the efficient equilibrium price and the quantity are reached. The greater quantity produced corrects the underallocation of resources devoted to the vaccine. Exhibit 7. The impact of a tax or subsidy on a market. Part A shows that what happens when the government taxes producers for each unit sold. The supply curve shifts leftwards from S1 to S2 as the tax adds to the cost of production. The equilibrium moves from E1 to E2, which raises the price and reduces the quantity in the market. In Part B, the government subsidies pays consumers for each unit purchased. This increases the benefits from consumption and shifts the demand curve rightward from D1 to D2. The equilibrium moves from E1 to E2, which raises the price and increases the quantity in the market. Key terms: price ceiling, price floor, market failure, externalities, public good. Summary: market failure occurs when the market mechanism does not achieve an efficient allocation of resources. Sources of market failure include lack of competition, externalities, and public goods. Although controversial, government intervention is possible to correct market failure. An externality is a cost or benefit of a good imposed on people who are not buyers or sellers of that good. Pollution is an example of external cost, which means too many resources are used to reduce the product responsible for the pollution. Two basic approaches to solve this market failure are regulation and pollution taxes. Vaccinations provide external benefits, which means sellers devote too few resources to reducing the product. Two basic solutions to this type of market failure are laws that require consumption of shots and special subsidies. Public goods are goods that are consumed by all people in society, regardless whether who pays for it or not. Natural events, air traffic control, and other public goods can benefit many individuals simultaneously and are provided by the government. Price ceilings and price floors are maximum and minimum prices enacted by law, instead of allowing the forces of supply and demand to determine prices. The price ceiling is the maximum price mandated by the government, and a price floor or support price is the minimum legal price. If a price ceiling is set below the equilibrium price, a shortage will persist. If a price floor is set above the equilibrium price, a surplus will persist. The demand curve, which shows the consumer's willingness to pay for a product, is the marginal benefit curve. The supply curve, which shows the minimum price necessary for producers to cover the opportunity cost reduction and be willing to offer a product for sale, is the marginal cost curve. The competitive market equilibrium is efficient because at the level of production, the marginal benefit of consumption is just equal to the marginal cost of production. If firms are able to reduce competition by colliding to restricting supply, then an inefficient equilibrium will result with an artificially high price and too few resources devoted to the production of that good. When the supply curve fails to include external costs, the equilibrium price is artificially low, and equilibrium quantity is artificially high. External costs cause the market to over-allocate resources. When the demand market fails to include external cost benefits, the equilibrium price is artificially low, and the equilibrium quantity is artificially low. External benefits cause the market to under-allocate resources. If public goods are available only in the marketplace, people wait for someone else to pay, and the result is the underproduction or zero production of public goods. A price ceiling, such as rent control, establishes a maximum price a seller can charge, and results in a shortage of the market. A price floor establishes a minimum price of a seller can charge, and results in a surplus in the market. A minimum wage is an example of a price floor in the labor market, and the surplus that results in unemployment. Study questions and problems. See Appendix A for answers to the odd-numbered questions. Your instructor has access to the answers to the even-numbered questions. 1. Market researchers have studied the market for milk, and their estimates for the supply of and demand for milk per month are as follows. Sample quiz. Please see Appendix B for answers to sample quiz questions. 1. The competitive equilibrium is efficient because at the level output, A. The marginal benefit of consuming the last unit exchanged exceeds the marginal cost of producing it. B. The marginal benefit of consuming the last unit exchange equals the marginal cost of producing it. Equals marginal cost of producing it. C. The marginal benefit of consuming the last unit exchange is less than the marginal cost of producing it. Or D. The cost of reduction is 0. 2. Which of the following terms describes a situation in which society is doing the best it can with the existing resources and technology? A. Market failure. B. Externality. C. Efficiency. Or D. Public good. 3. Assume no price ceilings exist in the market. Then a price ceiling is established below the market equilibrium. What would result? A. A shortage. B. Equilibrium. C. Surplus. Or D. Exchange price. 4. Which of the following is not an example of a market failure? A. Lacking competition. B. Externalities. C. Efficient equilibrium. Or D. Public goods. 5. A cost imposed on people other than the consumers of a good or service is A. Price floor. B. Negative externality. C. Positive externality. Or D. Price ceiling. 6. A supply curve represents A. The marginal benefit of consumption. B. The marginal cost of production. C. The external benefit of consumption. Or D. The external cost of production. 7. A demand curve represents A. The marginal benefit of consumption. B. The marginal cost of production. C. The external benefit of consumption. Or D. The external cost of production. A. Which of the following results when too many resources are devoted to the production of a good? A. Penalties will be imposed by the government. B. The marginal benefit will exceed the marginal cost of the last unit exchange. C. The marginal benefit will equal the marginal cost of the last unit exchange. Or D. The marginal cost will exceed the marginal benefit of the last unit exchange. 9. In a market with external costs such as pollution, the government may intervene to overcome market inefficiencies by A. Paying a per unit subsidy to producers equal to the external cost per unit. B. Imposing a per unit tax on producers equal to the external cost. C. Regulating the market to require producers to increase their production. Or D. Enacting laws requiring consumers to purchase more than the product. 10. Which of the following terms describes a good or service where users collectively consume benefits and there's no way to bar people who do not pay, free riders from consuming the good or service? A. Public good. B. Private good. C. Competitive good. Or D. Rival good. a price ceiling is set at $10 and the equilibrium market price is set at $8, which price will consumers actually pay? A. $10, B. $8, C. $18, or D. $2? Using the data, graph the demand for and supply for milk. Identify the equilibrium point as E, and use the dotted lines to connect E to the equilibrium price on the price axis and the equilibrium quantity on the quantity axis. B. At a quantity of $200, what is the marginal benefit of milk consumption? What is the marginal cost of milk production? Explain whether this represents an under- or overproduction of milk. C. Suppose the government enacts a milk price floor of $8 per gallon. Show this on your graph and explain the effect on the milk market. What objective could the government be trying to achieve by establishing such a price floor? D. Now assume the government decides to set a price ceiling of $4 per gallon. Show and explain how this legal price affects your graph of the milk market. What objective could the government be trying to achieve by establishing such a price ceiling? Use a graph to show the impact of a price of Japanese cars sold in the United States if the United States imposes import quotas and other trade restrictions that decrease the supply of Japanese cars. Now try another graph to show how the change in the price of Japanese cars affects the price of American-made cars in the United States. Explain the market outcome in each graph and the link between the two graphs. 3. Using the market supply and demand analysis, explain why labor union leaders are strong advocates of raising the minimum wage above the equilibrium wage. 4. The U.S. government fights the use of illegal drugs in various ways, including spraying cops with poisonous chemicals, imposing jail sentences for dealers, and confiscating drug transporting cars, boats, and planes. Which market failure motivates the government to interfere in the market of drugs? Lack of competition, externalities, or public goods? 5. Consider the market for apartments. What impact will the elimination of effective price ceiling rent control have on the equilibrium price of apartments? 6. Consider the statement, government involvement in markets is inherently ineffective. Do you agree or disagree? Explain. 7. Suppose coal-burning firms are emitting excessive pollution into the air. Suggest 2 ways the government can deal with this market failure. 8. Explain the impact of external costs and external benefits on resource allocation. 9. Why are public goods not produced in specific quantities by public markets? 10. Which of the following are public goods? A. Airbags, B. Pencils, C. Cycle helmets, D. Streetlights, E. Contact lenses. 11. At sold at concerts, sports contests, and other events, some ticket holders try to resell their tickets for more than they pay. For this to occur, must the original ticket price be legally set at a price floor, at the equilibrium price, or a price ceiling? 12. Suppose the state of California imposes a minimum wage of $20 per hour. In the entry-level labor market of California, fast food restaurants, the quantity of labor demanded at $20 per hour is 800,000, and the quantity of labor supplied is 1.2 million. Which of the following is true? A. There's a shortage of 800,000 workers in the labor market. B. There's a surplus of 400,000 workers in the labor market. C. There's a shortage of 400,000 workers in the labor market. And D. There's a surplus in the above 1.2 million workers in the labor market. 13. Suppose the federal government imposes a price floor in the milk market at a price of $6 per gallon. If the market quantity demanded at $6 is 1 billion gallons, and the market quantity supplied is 1.5 billion gallons, which of the following is true? A. There's a shortage in 500 million gallons of milk, and the federal government will buy 100 billion gallons to maintain the $6 price. B. There's a surplus of 500 million gallons of milk, and the federal government would buy these 500 million gallons to maintain the $6 price. C. There's a shortage of 500 million gallons of milk, and the federal government would buy an additional 500 million gallons to maintain the $6 price. Or D. There's a surplus of 100 billion gallons of milk, and the federal government would buy 1.5 billion gallons to maintain the $6 price. 14. Suppose the city of Arctic, California imposes rent control so the rents can cannot exceed $1,000 per month in one-bedroom rental units. Suppose $1,000 has also been the equilibrium rental price in Antarctica before the huge new apartment complex was built in the nearby town of McKinleyville, where rents are $800 per month. Which of the following most likely is true? A. There's a shortage in renting housing in Antarctica at the renting control price of $1,000. B. There's a lasting surplus of rental housing in Antarctica after the new apartment complex was built in McKinleyville. C. The equilibrium rental price of Antarctica will fall below $1,000. Thus, rent control will not affect the rent market in Antarctica. B. The equilibrium price of $1,000 per month in Antarctica will not change. 15. Suppose the federal government provides wheat farmers with a price floor above the market equilibrium price of wheat, creating a surplus. Which of the following causes the reduction in the surplus of wheat? A. The elimination of the price floor. B. An increase in the price of wheat. C. A decrease in the demand for wheat. Or D. An increase in the supply of wheat. 16. If society allows firms to freely pollute the environment, which of the following is true? A. Market equilibrium output will be too high to relevate to the efficient output level. B. Market equilibrium output will be too low relative to the effective output level. C. Market equilibrium output will be equivalent to the efficient output level. Or D. The efficient output level can be achieved by giving firms a subsidy for pollution they generate. 17. If there are external benefits of good X, which of the following is true? A. A socially effective amount of good X can be achieved in society taxes consumers of good X. B. The socially effective amount of good X can be achieved if society subsidizes consumers for the good of X. C. The socially effective amount of good X will be equivalent to the free market equilibrium quantity. Or D. The socially effective amount of good X does not exist. 18. Suppose the federal government imposes new pollution tax of a cent per kilowatt hour of electricity on coal-fired power producers. Which of the following describes this tax? How this tax will affect the market for electricity served by the power plants? A. Demand for electricity will decrease. B. Demand for electricity will increase. C. The supply of electricity will decrease. Or D. The supply of electricity will increase. 19. Why don't competitive markets do a good job providing public goods? A. Because people do not receive benefits from public goods. B. Because firms can't produce enough goods to satisfy market demand. C. Because public goods generate negative externalities and pollution taxes and reduce the incentive for farmers to supply public goods. B. It is difficult to exclude people from getting benefits from public goods without paying for them, so market demand does not reflect the benefits to society for a public good. 20. Market failure can be best described as a situation where markets do not result in A. A fair price. B. An exchange of goods and services. C. An efficient allocation of resources. Or D. An equilibrium. Apex to Chapter 4. Consumer surplus, producer surplus, and market efficiency. Chapter 4 explained how the equilibrium price and quantity determined in a competitive market are desirable because the result is market efficiency. Here, we examine efficiency further and use the area shown on the graph between the market price and the demand and supply curves to measure gains or losses from market transactions for consumers and producers. 4A-1. Consumer surplus. Consider the market demand curve shown in Exhibit A1A. As we show, the height of this demand curve shows the maximum willingness of consumers to produce ground beef at various prices per pound. At price of $4, point X, no one will purchase ground beef. But if the price drops to $3.50 at point A, consumers will purchase 1 million pounds of ground beef per year. Moving downward along the demand curve to point B, consumers will purchase an additional 1 million pounds of ground beef per year at a lower price of $3 per pound. If the price continues to drop to $2.50 per pound at point C and lower, consumers are willing to purchase more pounds of ground beef consistent with the law of demand. Assuming the market equilibrium price for ground beef is at $2 per pound, we can use the demand curve to measure the net benefit or consumer surplus in the market. Consumer surplus is the value of difference between market consumers are willing to pay for a product on the demand curve and the price actually paid for it. At point A, consumers are willing to pay $3.50 per pound, but they actually paid the equilibrium price of $2 per pound. Thus, consumers earn a surplus of $1.50 per pound, multiplied by 1 million pounds purchased, which is $1.5 million per consumer surplus. This value is represented by the gray area vertical rectangle formed at point A on the demand curve. At point B, consumers who purchase an additional 1 million pounds of ground beef at $3 per pound receive a lower extra consumer surplus than at point A, represented by the triangle on the lower height. At point C, the marginal consumer surplus, represented by continues to fall until it reaches equilibrium point E, where there is no consumer surplus. The total value of consumer surplus can be interpreted from the explanation given above, as shown in Exhibit A1B. Begin at point X, and instead of selecting prices, now imagine offering ground beef to consumers at each price downward along the demand curve until the equilibrium price of $2 is reached at point E. The result is that the entire green rectangle area between the demand curve and the horizontal line at the equilibrium price represents a total consumer surplus. Note that the rise in the equilibrium price decreases the total consumer surplus, and a fall in the equilibrium price increases the total consumer surplus. Take note, consumer surplus is the value of the difference between the price consumers are willing to pay and the price they actually pay for the product. Total consumer surplus is represented by the total area underneath the market demand curve above the equilibrium price. Exhibit A1, Market Demand Curve and Consumer Surplus. As illustrated in Part A, consumers at point A on the market demand curve are willing to pay $3.50 per pound to purchase 1 million pounds of ground beef per year. Since the equilibrium price is $2, this means they receive a consumer surplus of $1.50 per pound of ground beef, and the vertical gray area, shaded rectangular area, is a consumer surplus earned only at point A. Others who are willing to pay less at points B, C, and E receive less consumer surplus, and the height of the corresponding rectangles falls at each of these prices. At point B, moving downward along the possible prices of the demand curve yields the green shaded area of the triangle, which is equal to the total consumer surplus net benefit. For A2, consumer surplus. Similar to the concept of consumer surplus, the height of the market demand supply curve in Exhibit A2A shows the producer's minimum willingness to accept the payment of ground beef offered for sale at various prices per pound. At point X, firms offer no ground beef at sale at a price of $0. They divert their resources to alternative use. At the price of $50 per pound, point A, the supply curve tells us that 1 million pounds will be offered. At point A, films for sale. Moving upward along the supply curve to point B, films will offer an additional 1 million pounds of ground beef for sale at a higher price of $1 per pound. If the price rises to $1.50 at point C and higher, firms will allocate more resources to ground beef production, and another 1 million pounds will be supplied along the supply curve. Exhibit A2, Market Supply Curve and Producer Surplus. In Part A, films are willing to supply 1 million pounds of ground beef per year at 50 cents, point A. Because $2 is the equilibrium price, the sellers earn a producer surplus of $1.50 per pound of ground beef sold. The first vertical shaded rectangle is producer surplus earned only at point A. At points B, C, and E, sellers receive less producer surplus at each of the higher prices, and the sizes of the rectangles fall. In Part B, moving upward along all possible selling points in the supply curve yields a red shaded triangle that is equal to the total consumer surplus net benefit. Again, we will assume that the equilibrium price of $2 per pound and the supply curve were used to measure the net benefit or producer surplus. Producer surplus is the value of the difference between actual selling price of a product and the price producers are willing to sell it on the supply curve. Now assume the first 1 million pounds of ground beef were sold at point A on the supply curve. In this case, producer surplus is the difference between equilibrium selling price of $2 and the 50 cents price that is the minimum price that producers will accept to supply this quantity of ground beef. Thus, the producer surplus is equal to $1.50 per pound, multiplied at $1 million per pound, which is a $1.5 million producer surplus. This value is represented by the vertical gray shaded rectangle formed at point A on the supply curve. The second 1 million pounds of ground beef offered at sale at point B would generate a producer surplus because the selling price of $2 exceeds the $1 price at which firms are willing to supply this additional quantity of beef. Note that the producer surplus is lower in point B compared to point A, and the marginal producer surplus continues to fall at point C until it reaches 0 at the equilibrium point E. The total value of producer surplus is represented in Exhibit A2B. Start at point X, where none of the product will be supplied at a price of 0. Now consider the quantities of ground beef producers are willing to offer for sale at each possible price along the supply curve until the equilibrium price of $2 is reached at point E. The result is the entire rectangular area between the horizontal line of the equilibrium price and supply curve represents the total producer surplus. Take note, producer surplus is the value of the difference between the actual selling price of a product and the price producers are willing to sell it for. The total producer surplus is represented by the total area above the supply curve and below the equilibrium price. 4A3. Market efficiency. We learned earlier that the equilibrium price and quantity that result in a competitive market achieve market efficiency because the marginal benefit of the last unit sold, read off of the demand curve, equals the marginal cost of the last unit sold, read off of the supply curve. In this section, the equilibrium price and quantity will be shown to achieve market efficiency because in any other market price, the total net benefits to consumers and producers will be less. In other words, competitive markets are efficient when they maximize the sum of consumers and producer surplus. The analysis continues in Exhibit A3A, which combines parts B from each of the two previous exhibits. The green triangle represents consumer surplus earned in the excess of $2 equilibrium price consumers pay for ground beef. The red triangle represents the producer surplus producers receive by selling ground beef at $2 per pound in excess of the minimum price at which they are willing to supply it. The total net benefit, total surplus, is therefore the entire rectangular area consisting of both green consumer surplus and red producer surplus triangles. Now consider Exhibit A3B, the consequences to market efficiency of producers devoting fewer resources to ground beef production. If only 2 million pounds of ground beef were being bought and sold per year, the marginal benefit, point A, exceeds the marginal cost, point B. An efficiency would require devoting more resources to production of ground beef. We can also use the analysis describing in this appendix to show this inefficiency. When too few resources are devoted to ground beef production, the result is deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is the net loss of consumer and producer surplus from the underreduction or overreduction of a product. In Exhibit A3B, the deadweight loss is equal to the gray triangle ABE, which represents the total surplus of green and red triangles in Part A that is not obtained because the market is operating below equilibrium point E. Exhibit A3C illustrates the deadweight loss of consumers and producer surplus that could also result from overproduction. Now suppose more resources are devoted to production and 6 million pounds of ground beef were bought and sold at the equilibrium price. However, from producer side of the market, the equilibrium sale price is only $2 and is below any possible selling price on the supply curve between points E and C. Therefore, films have a net loss for each pound sold beyond 4 million pounds, represented by the area under the supply curve and bounded below the horizontal equilibrium price line. Similarly, consumers pay the equilibrium price of $2, but this price exceeds any price consumers are willing to pay between points E and D on the demand curve. This means consumers experience a total net benefit loss for each pound purchased, represented by the portion of gray area above the demand curve, but below the horizontal equilibrium price line. The total net loss of consumer-producer surplus, deadweight loss, is equal to the gray area EDC. This inefficiency is confirmed by noting that at 6 million pounds of ground beef exchanged per year, the marginal cost reduction at point C exceeds the marginal benefit at point D, and fewer resources should be devoted to the reduction of ground beef. Exhibit A3, Comparison of Market Efficiency and Deadweight Loss. In Part A, the green triangle represents consumer surplus, and the red triangle represents producer surplus. The total net benefit, or total surplus, is the entire triangle consisting of consumer and producer surplus triangles. In Point B, too few resources are used to reduce 2 million pounds of ground beef compared to the 4 million pounds at equilibrium point E. The market is inefficient because the deadweight loss gray triangle, ABE, is no longer earned in either consumers or producers. As shown in Part C, the overreduction at the equilibrium price of $2 can be also inefficient. If 6 million pounds of ground beef were offered for sale, too many resources are devoted to the product, and the deadweight loss of area EDC occurs. Take note, the total value of potential benefits is not achieved is the general loss resulting from too few or too many resources used in a given market. Key terms: consumer surplus, producer surplus, deadweight loss. Summary: consumer surplus measures the value between the price consumers are willing to pay for a product along the demand curve and the price they actually pay. Producer surplus measures the value between the actual selling price of a product and the price along the supply curve at which sellers are willing to sell the product. Total surplus is the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus. Deadweight loss is the net loss of both consumer and producer surplus resulting from the underproduction or overproduction of a product. Study questions and problems. See Appendix A for answers to odd-numbered questions. Your instructor has access to the answers of even-numbered questions. 1. Consider the market for used textbooks. Use Exhibit A4 to calculate the total consumer surplus. 2. Consider the market for used textbooks. Use Exhibit A5 to calculate the total producer surplus. 3. Using Exhibits A4 and A5, calculate the total surplus. Then calculate the effect on consumer surplus, producer surplus, and the total surplus of a fall in the equilibrium price of textbooks from $30 to $15 each. Explain the meaning of your calculations. 4. Use Exhibit A6, and assuming the market is at equilibrium QE, identify areas ACE, DCE, and ACE. Now explain the result of underproduction of Q in terms of area BCG, GCF, and BCF. Sample quiz. See Appendix B for answers to sample quiz questions. 1. Consumer surplus measures the value between the price consumers are willing to pay and the A. Producer surplus price, B. Deadweight gain price, C. Actual price paid, or D. Preference price. 2. If Salmon is willing to pay $50 for one good X, $30 for the second, and $20 for the third, and $8 for the fourth, and the market price is $10, what is Sam's consumer surplus? A. $10, B. $40, C. $70, or D. $10? 3. Suppose Tucker Inc. is willing to sell one Gemzo for $10, a second Gemzo for $15, and a third for $20, and the market price is $25. What is Tucker's Inc. producer surplus? A. $10, B. $15, C. $30, or D. $50? In an effective market, deadweight loss is A. Maximum, B. Minimum, C. Constant, D. 0. 5. Deadweight loss results from A. Equilibrium, B. Underproduction, C. Overproduction, D. None of the above, or E. B or C. 6. Deadweight loss is a net loss of A. Consumer surplus, B. Producer surplus, C. Disequilibrium surplus, or D. Both A and B. 7. If the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded in the market, what is the result? A. Deadweight loss, B. Inefficiency, C. Overreduction, or D. All of the above answers are correct. 8. Suppose consumers are willing to pay $20 for one good X, $10 for the second, and $5 for the third, and the market price is $4. What is the consumer surplus? A. $16, B. $6, C. $1, or D. $23? 9. Producer surplus measures the value between the actual selling price and the A. prices sellers are willing to sell the product, B. deadweight loss price, C. lowest price sellers are willing to sell the product, or D. profit maximization price. 10. Suppose seller X is willing to sell one good X for $5, the second good X for $10, and the third for $16, and the fourth for $25, and the market price is $20. What is seller X's producer surplus? A. $15, B. $20, C. $22, or D. $29? Deadweight loss is the result of A. disequilibrium, B. underproduction, C. overproduction, or D. all of the above. 12. If at any given level of production, a deadweight loss exists, then A. marginal benefit equals marginal cost, B. marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost, C. marginal benefit is less than marginal cost, or D. either B or C. 13. Deadweight loss is not a result of A. an efficient market, B, an inefficient market, C, zero consumer surplus, or D, zero producer surplus. 14. At the equilibrium price, deadweight loss is A, minimize, B, 0, C, maximize, or D, equal to the equilibrium price multiplied by the quantity exchanged. 15. If the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied in a market, what is the result? A, deadweight loss, B, inefficiency, C, underproduction, or D, all the above answers are correct. 16. As shown as Exhibit A7, if the market is in equilibrium, blank represents consumer surplus. A, B, E, C, A, E, D, E, G, H, or B, E, F. 17. As shown in Exhibit A7, if the market is in equilibrium, blank represents producer surplus. A, D, E, F, B, C, E, F, D, E, G, H, or B, E, F. 18. As shown as Exhibit A7, if the quantity supplied is 2 million pounds of ground beef per year, what is the result? A, deadweight loss, B, inefficiency, C, underproduction, D, all of the above, or E, none of the above. 19. As shown as Exhibit A7, if the quantity supplied is at 6 million pounds of ground beef per year, what is the result? A, deadweight loss, B, inefficiency, C, overreduction, D, all of the above, or E, none of the above. 20. As shown as Exhibit A7, if the quantity supplied is 2 million pounds of ground beef per year, the result is the deadweight loss represented by an area A, B, E, C, C, E, F, D, E, G, H, or B, E, F. And that's it.